immediately go to the website and watch part 1, or you're going to be completely lost because the plot completely went crazy. When we last left our intrepid heroes, Mr. Probst was about to be dipped in a vat of molten glass. No, not really. You got to unmute yourself, Chris. My name is Jay Holben. I'm an associate member of the American Society of Cinematographers and a contributing editor to American Cinematographer magazine. And what confuses a lot of people is I'm actually an independent producer and director, but yet a lover of cinematography and a former cinematographer. So also a super lens nerd, along with Mr. Christopher Probst, ASC, who is a fellow lens nerd and has been a partner in crime now for 30 years?
Almost.
Yeah.
Close.
Yeah. So the plan here is that we are picking up where we left off in episode 1. There were so many questions that came through that we didn't get a chance to address that we want to dive right in and start answering some of those questions that were left over from last time, and then dive into more questions this time. So if you have questions as we're going, please be sure to put them in the Q&A box. And also for everybody watching, if you look at the questions in the Q&A box and somebody has asked your question or you're interested in the question, please vote it up. Put the little thumbs up. That's really helpful for us to know which ones to get to and kind of put a priority there. So good morning, Mr. Probst. Welcome. Thank you for coming back. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. You and I never talk, so it's great to see you.
Right. I know it's been so long. I feel like I don't know you anymore.
I know. Exactly.
What are we talking about? Talk about more lenses again? Is that what we're doing here?
I think so.
Hot topic.
Yeah.
I want to know about that. We had a number of questions that we weren't able to get to, but I have some of them here. Is the plan to kind of jump in on these and see what that sparks?
Yeah, absolutely. There's I don't know what this K35, K36 thing.
Yeah.
Does some people ask some questions about?
Never heard of it.
Yeah, really.
One. Yeah, it seems like, I don't know why, but a lot of people are interested in these things and somehow want to ask me about them. I don't know why that has started, but yeah. To address some of these sort of questions, yes, I've kind of immersed myself over the last, I don't know, 6 or 7 years in K35 and Canon glass, specifically mostly 70s glass, trying to learn about the origins of them as well as the different generations of them, how they changed over time. I've purchased many sets and had them either PL converted to use on cameras because they did not originally come in a PL mount. They predated the invention of the PL, which was 1982. And K35 started coming out in 1973 with the 55 millimeter as the first focal length that was released in 73. And then once TLS in England, True Lens Services, started doing full rehousings, I then sent a number of lenses to be fully converted, which replaces all of the mechanics and just retains the glass, which has really transformed the usefulness of those lenses. Yeah, I kind of became a de facto expert on a lot of these things just by owning and manipulating and repurposing and fixing and deconstructing these lenses and trying to figure out their origins and prove their origins, and then realizing certain focal lengths had no origin, that they were custom made. But it's been a long journey. And so a lot of people over the years who have been interested in those lenses and have bought the lenses and had questions, and even rental houses who needed repair lenses have contacted me to figure out where to get replacement glass, or looking for actual lenses to buy, or all of those above. So,
especially with regard to the K35s, you've kind of become the go-to guru.
Yeah, I went a little bonkers, truth be told, but yeah, I really love them because for me, the real important factor is I shoot a lot of super 35 plus imagers, and I like what a larger imager size, besides just a larger resolution, but a larger imager size also influences your depth of field and how you can control that and use that as a component in designing a look. So as you get into a larger imager size, your field of view increases. Your focal length stays the same. So if you put a 50 millimeter lens on a Super 35 camera, it looks as you expect a 50 millimeter lens to look like on Super 35. And that's kind of like what I use as my default comparison of field of view equivalency. So everything is related back to my background in Super 35 and shooting on 35 millimeter film. When you go to a larger imager size, let's just say full frame or VistaVision, kind of using those terms interchangeably, the 50 millimeter lens is still a 50 millimeter lens. All of the perspective and magnification stays the same, but the field of view is changed. The angle of view, specifically what the lens sees, as long as it covers the imager, if you are just grabbing this little square, that's great. But if it actually covers more and you then create a larger imager sample, the angle of view is going to increase, but the depth of field is the same. So for an equivalent shot of a 35 millimeter on a Super 35, I could put a 55 millimeter K35 on the lens and have the depth of field of the 55, but the angle of view of the 35. So it's a little bit wider, but still has shallow depth of field. And that gets really important with the 24 millimeter. So you can start to have a wide angle lens that still has a slightly shallow depth of field. And that's part of the properties of something like a 65 millimeter format, where they actually struggle with trying to get some stop in because the depth of field is so slight for the lenses. Your wide angle lens becomes a 50 or an 80 millimeter lens on 65 millimeter. So you're kind of battling that depth of field. You don't want to be shooting at a 1.3 on an 80 millimeter. So then you're dealing with the other way. You're trying to build a blight. You're trying to stop down to have some degree of in-focus background to give context to your scenes or whatever. So for me, the K35s in terms of a vintage lens represented a sweet spot because I'm still capturing semi-larger format. I do not call full frame or VistaVision large format. That's kind of been a raped term. It's been adopted. It's not even medium format. It's certainly not large format because in still photography, this term has been around for decades. And, land cameras and view cameras and all that sort of stuff are large format. You're talking 8 by 10 inches, not 65 millimeter, and certainly not 36 by 24 millimeters is not large format. So I don't like the term LF for the area that they adopted. They could have went with FF and that would have been great. Alexa FF, full frame. That's what it is, not large format. It's a larger format than Academy or Super 35, but certainly not large format. But so the K35s represented coverage on that full frame VistaVision sensor, but with the vintage properties that I was interested in using for certain jobs. Whereas a lot of the vintage cinema glass was not designed even for Super 35. It didn't exist really. I mean, they dabbled with super scope and that sort of stuff in the 50s, and it didn't really take off as a viable widescreen alternative format. There was a handful of films that were made that way. And then Joe Dutton in the early 1980s, I think 1982, made a documentary called Dance Craze. And he resurrected the Super Scope format. And then he was friends with both Kubrick and his cinematographer, John Alton, who then started to adopt Super 35 as a shooting format and did films like Greystoke and that sort of stuff in Super 35. But anyway, relating that back to vintage lenses, they were not designed for Super 35 or full frame. They are Academy lenses. So they struggle, especially on the wides. That's really where you're battling, trying to produce coverage in kind of the area of optimum performance in that area. And then as soon as you get beyond that, you can run into problems with, well, what was the barrel built for? They weren't thinking about extended coverage, so you can get into mechanical occlusion of the actual barrels, or you get into fall off of performance and vignetting and shading and increased distortion at the edges. So all those aspects on Academy lenses are very limiting on what you can do. And the issue is a lot of sensors, since the onset of digital cinematography, have kind of abandoned the idea of a film gate standard. We had for numbers of years a very settled, agreed upon dimension for 1.85 film gate or anamorphic film gate or 133 or what have you. Those were accepted SMPTE standards, and all the cameras complied to that. As soon as it went to digital sensors, and everyone had to have their own proprietary fabrication of digital sensors, which are encumbered by the processes of microprocessor wafer fabrication and designing the actual photosite pixels. That's all proprietary, and it's all specific to each manufacturer. So now you're trying to say, okay, my particular photosite is 8 microns, or mine is 4.5 microns, or mine is 10 microns. And how many of those now can I cram into a finite area? And if I try to limit it just to the SMPTE standard of Academy, I may not be able to hit a resolution target I want to get. The number of samples, let's say horizontally, I can't get 4K across when I have a 10 micron photosite pitch. So that that meant, screw it. We're going to have, if we want to hit this target, we're going to go beyond the SMPTE standard, and we're going to just do whatever. So then it became the Wild West of every sensor manufacturer, every camera manufacturer having their own specs of slightly Super 35ish or Super 35 plus or Super 35 plus plus, ranging all the way from, you know, like Dragon red or helium red, having a 5 micron or a 3.65 micron, or a Dulsa camera, which was almost halfway, a little over halfway between Super 35 and full frame, with the origin sensor was like 34 millimeter wide horizontally. And then you have, open gate area, that's starting to push the dimensions. So all this coverage area starts to become an issue. So having a lens that begins with larger coverage to begin with, I can then vary all my sampling size within there and use it as a controlling factor too, and picking, you know, if I wanted to have increased fall off of depth of field by going with a larger sampling area or not. So that kind of grounded a lot of the decision to move into the K35 lenses. Plus, I really like the look that they create. And there's some questions that we had about, like, you use the term creamy, you know, and what is the idea of, like, what is that supposed to mean versus trying to define it scientifically? One of the things that you and I, Jay, have been doing with the book is kind of doing both, is talking about, well, what is the scientific breakdown of what that would mean? And we have an idea of what we could define that look as well as what is the sort of the layman's aesthetic term of what is a creamy lens, or what is an edgy lens, or, you know, all of that, or distorted lens. So we can
a lot of people have their own artistic interpretations of, like you said, creamy or soft. What does soft mean?
Right.
Well,
yeah, that's a slippery slope, because you're starting to battle the confusing differentiation between sharpness and resolution and contrast. So, you know, these are all things that obviously interplay, and we can't divorce any one aspect of them. So for me, you know, a K35's creaminess is a function of two aspects primarily that I'm interested in, and the end goal is another aspect. So the two functions are spherical aberration, which lends a certain amount of smoothness to the way that the focus rolls off, a certain bloominess that can, with extreme cases, it can spread the rays and create a blurry bloom to pinpoints of light, especially at the periphery, as well as the coatings and the interaction of light and flare and reflection, specifically veiling glare. So both of those things are affecting what is the parameter I want to be able to customize, which is contrast reproduction in a scene. So I'm looking at veiling glare and spherical aberration, and that sort of smoothness, that creaminess, as a function of what is the contrast of the scene that I want to capture. And it's interesting to note that one of those parameters is also intertwined with the f-stop of the lens. So spherical aberration is influenced by your f-stop. So you'll have more of it the wider open you are, and you can affect it by stopping down. So that becomes a variable controller, is if I really want to have, a blurriness to a scene, creaminess, I can shoot wide open and use ND filters. And I'm specifically trying to address how much spherical aberration I'm allowing as a controlling factor. And on the coding side is how much sort of in-camera direct lighting is there, because that's going to create veiling glare. If there's a hot window in the background, that can cream out the scene. Or if I allow a certain amount of stray light to hit the lens, that can cream out the scene. So all that is about, like, what is the contrast that I'm looking to create? And this sort of interaction with contrast and the scene is wholly different than doing it in color correction, because certainly blooming and veiling glare is organic and interactive with the environmental lighting. The same way that, like, having smoke on the set is going to interact with the light coming in through a window very differently than trying to make the contrast softer in post-production, or trying to add in beams in color correction. It's not the same as actually having the atmosphere on the set. On the set, you're also creating a certain amount of depth cues. So all these sort of things kind of dovetail, interplay with each other. But that is a very long-winded explanation of why I I gravitated toward these K35s and trying to learn about where they came from, how I can utilize them, how I can knock them off, how I can repair them, and rehousing them. So, for example, I have a 55 millimeter TLS rehousing of a K35 lens. So basically all new mechanics, just retaining some of the actual lens head metalwork and obviously the glass. And then you try to find as clean of a specimen as you can. They go through and they clean them when they rehouse them, but it greatly increases the functionality of the lens, specifically the wider lenses up to 35, the 35 being the widowmaker of it. When it was originally rehoused, the focus scale rotation was only about 45 degrees for the entire scale. So that means, like, it was literally like encompassed within the gear lash. The slop of the actual mechanics could be the difference between 6 feet and 8 feet. And that's big on a 35 millimeter lens, especially if you're jumping to like a larger sensor, like almost full frame. That amount of interplay can be very difficult to keep anything in focus. So I would often tell people, like, barely touch it until the very end, because as soon as you go past and you start to get into macro focusing, the whole image goes soft, and the scale is so compressed, it becomes very hard to deal with. So I would either slightly try to avoid jumping onto the 35, or avoid doing really dramatic push-ins on it, because it was very hard to pull focus for the assistants. When TLS went ahead and rehoused them, now that focus rotation is 300 degrees. So the amount of resolution of the actual rotation of the barrel that I can get into fine detail of 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, I mean, it's much more specific and controllable. That was really a revelation in terms of using that specific focal length. So that kind of answers that. We have about 20 questions from last session about K35.
So we'll be here for 9.5 hours.
I hope that covered a lot of it. And everyone's just completely satisfied, because other stuff I'm just not going to tell you about, because that's either A, in the book, or B, it's not time for you to know it yet, because I'm still working out some stuff.
Right. We had a number of questions about what is this book and when is it coming out from last time. So Chris and I have spent the last almost 6.5 years now writing what we hope to be the major treatise on Cine lenses, which there's nothing out there currently that exists. So this is a 1,200 page book that covers everything you didn't know that you wanted to know about Cine lenses. And that's what we've been working on. We're hoping for it to be out end of next year. It's called the Cine Lens Manual. At least that's what it's called right now. And this has been our passion and our albatross. I don't know what to say.
Nail in the coffin. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, exactly. For the last over half decade. And that's kind of what brings us to this conversation too.
Should we give them a pitch of what the book is going to entail? Basically,
sure.
the way I try to summarize what the book covers is we span everything from sand, where we make glass. We melt sand, we make glass. We we take glass and we form a shape. We define what the different lens shapes are. It could be the lentil sort of shape of a biconvex glass or not. So we talk about shapes. Then we take shapes and we group them together, and we discuss the sort of evolution of all these lens groupings. And we form a lens with different elements together. Then we talk about the history of how all these different lens designs evolved, and then how those relate to Cine lenses. Then we talk about all the different imperfections that can create when you start to create lens groupings. And we define what aberrations are, and we go through all of that. We talk about light behavior. We talk about then taking those elements and putting them into a actual lens and moving them around mechanically. How does that work? And there's a little bit actually written about how Cine lenses mechanics work. So we break that down and we move them around. And then we talk about the various lenses that were housed and what the legacy of the designs were that pulled from the 1800s and whatnot. And then we move into actual movies and we discuss this lens. It was made by Cook in the 1930s, and these are the sort of movies that shot on. So we relate back what the actual lens designs, where they came from, how they're made, how the glass is made, how they're moved around mechanically, and what movies they shot on. Then we go even further. We say, okay, what is anamorphic? How did that evolve? We talk about the widescreen craze of the 1950s, and we define all of those and what movies shot on what are those lenses and how do those work and how does anamorphic achieve its look and what does that do? And we talk about the movies that shot with the various formats and the various lenses and all of those that exist. Then we talk about larger formats, 65 millimeter, special processes. And we do a little bit of a history of all the different formats that have evolved over the time from the late 1800s all the way up to modern digital formats, and kind of define what that does and discuss about coverage and all those aspects. And then we talk about breaking lenses and modifying lenses and customizing lenses and rehousing lenses and what all that does, as well as servicing them and maintaining them and fixing them and also working in different conditions like in the rain or in the Arctic or whatnot, and everywhere in between ad nauseum, with the caveat that we are avoiding heavy degrees of calculus or trigonometry and trying to avoid the formula, but define it into an understandable language, which has kind of been our mission. Both Jay and I are writers and editors at American Cinematographer. I became the technical editor in 1998, and I had started writing with the magazine in 1994. So I'm over my 25-year anniversary with American Cinematographer with the specific goal of I wanted to learn a topic. I'm going to get paid to write an article to delve in and interview the experts about this topic, and then turn it into a language that a reader could readily understand. So it was a win-win for me because I could go and sit in Conrad Hall's living room and break down American Beauty frame by frame for 4 hours, ask him anything I wanted to get into his head, and then turn that into an article. But also I gained so much from doing that. And this has been an extension of that sort of philosophy. Is like, oh, we start talking about optics and we start doing some courses. I think we should know some more about that. Cut to 7 years later, here we are. Care to add anything about the book, Jay? Did I miss anything?
No, I think you covered pretty well. I mean, it just the only thing that we kind of add to that is the history and evolution. We start from the very fundamental of a photographic lens from the Petzval portrait and trace its optical design all the way through the early Zeiss designs and the early Cook designs into purpose-built cinema lenses, and then trace the purpose-built cinema lenses all the way up to, master anamorphics and Scorpios and, the new Ingenue Optimo primes and all the way up to modern day. So we have this complete historical evolution tracing where Cine lenses came from and how they have developed.
Yes.
It's a beast.
So some people are asking, we're talking about this book that doesn't exist. Yeah, and there's no pre-order yet. We are still basically finalizing. We're in the last throes of the writing of it. And then we have an extensive period of actually illustrating and photo gathering for the book and doing diagrams. So that's the next big hurdle is like, okay, we've written it, but now we've got to illustrate it. And that's going to take a good long amount of time as well. So we're targeting late 2021, I guess is what the target is. It now is called the Cine Lens Manual. So we have an actual Instagram page for that, so you can follow us there and get updated onto when we have a better timeline, and we'll start to do little promotional blurbs as we get closer to a release date, and we'll make announcements there as well. And also when we do things like this, we discuss lenses, we'll do postings on the Cine Lens Manual Instagram page. That being said,
you mentioned you kind of dove into spherical aberration, and I did a screen share and threw a couple of things, but I want to take a second and make sure that people understand these concepts and kind of talk about what that is and why that happens. So to explain spherical aberration, which is one of the 7 primary aberrations or 7 primary faults of optics. No lens is perfect. Every lens has some problems with it in imaging the world, and spherical aberration is one of them. And what happens, let's see if I get back to a screen share here real quick. I got to slide around the question box. We'll go back to screen share. We'll just share this screen and go boop. So what happens with spherical aberration is that we have spherically shaped lenses, and light that's passing through the middle of the lens travels a shorter distance to reach the imager than light that's passing through the fringes or the very edges of the lens. And they don't always focus to the same point. And when we don't get images, all of these rays here, these parallel rays, are coming from a single point at an infinite distance in space. And when they don't all meet up at the same point on the imager side, you get a slightly out of focus image. You get a slight
if you
blur.
think about it, it wants to throw the same curve of that front element, which is actually not just a curve that you're seeing in 2D here, but it's an actual sphere. It's it curves to the top and the bottom and to the side. So it actually wants to do a smaller curvature field. And that's one of the aspects of lens design that they grapple with, is trying to take a curved sampling of the environment and flatten it to a 2D plane at the imager level. Now, there have been technologies that have tried to have curved imagers, gates, sensors, whatever, to deal with this as well. But
still technologies.
Yeah, it wants to throw a curved ray bundle to the actual collection point. And so there are ways in optical design to try to flatten that and make that a flat image plane at the actual collection point, the sensor, the imager, the film gate, whatever. But this is the result of basically taking a spherical, a ball domed sampling of the environment, pushing it through a series of optics, and then trying to capture that.
And this is the result of what you're seeing with overcorrected or undercorrected spherical aberration in your out of focus highlights, what people call the bokeh. Is overcorrected spherical aberration, you get the soap bubble effect, where you get a highlight around the bokeh, this brighter edge to it. And then in undercorrected spherical aberration, you get sort of a hot center and a softer edge. And this affects the way that the out of focus image looks. It affects the way that your details are seen in out of focus, whether you have sharp edges to your out of focus elements, or whether you have a nice smooth, quote unquote, creamy out of focus aspect.
Yes.
They're in end of the lecture. Great.
Thanks for that. But again,
sure.
This is something that optical designers are trying to eliminate. As most aberrations are errors, they are imperfections in recreating the scene as it is in reality, and then it passes through these things and it has problems. It has inconsistencies, incongruities to what is actually out there and what's in. And there's a number of these factors. Like, I think people are pretty readily familiar with chromatic aberration. When you see color fringing around a hot contrasted highlight of a tree branch against the sky, you can get like a purple or a green fringe, and you kind of intuitively know that that's not a good thing, that you don't want that in your image. That's chromatic aberration. And it's a similar error of focusing of rays, specifically different color wavelengths. And we didn't talk in terms of spherical aberration in terms of actual color wavelengths, but that is a compounded problem that is beyond even just illustrating the idea of taking a curved sample and trying to then focus that onto a point and then having the rays at the periphery be focused at a different area. When you start to deal with color wavelength, it exacerbates that situation. Similarly to how chromatic aberration creates problems with high contrast and edges. All these sort of primary aberrations are known as ascidal aberrations. And these are the sort of the building blocks, the early aspects that, back to like the 1800s that lens designers were initially trying to grapple with and figure out how to correct. And it generated a lot of the legacy design solutions that could help it. And one of the biggest one of those was the idea of symmetry in an optical design. So if you have an element here that creates a certain error, and then you have an f-stop here, if you mirror that same element on the other side, it's going to undo the errors here and to the opposite side here. So you create chromatic aberration here, it goes through, and then it comes out the same lens, but in the opposite direction, it's going to undo that effect. So creating symmetry in an optical design is something that happened when they took a basic Gauss design and then they flipped it and they mirrored it, and that became the double Gauss, which is now the fundamental layout of virtually all fast, certainly 50 millimeters and beyond. A lot of like in the middle range of your optical designs where you're not getting into extreme wide angles and you're not getting into telephotos, but they sort of the meat of the lens set, a lot of times are a modernized derivation and repurposing of a double Gauss design. And that goes for the Summilux lenses, that goes for K35s, that goes for the Zeiss, planar 50s and stuff. These are all legacy derivations of a double Gauss design and using this idea of symmetry. You can start to add in other elements to correct things, but so understanding where we came from, how they decided to tackle these primary aberrations really starts to inform the lenses that were out there. And I think we mentioned last time, which started this whole process for Jay and I, is we did a test and we went to Panavision in Hollywood and dealt with Guy McVicker there and went through every 50 millimeter for a lens set that they had. And they have a pretty big array of not only their own Panavision glass, but also vintage glass spanning the entire history of motion picture. We did that as well at Camtech, who has, again, an extensive collection of different lens families and vintage glasses. So when we shot a 50 millimeter from every lens family, now that's only targeting basically double Gauss designs, but it was still very interesting to compare performance on multiple parameters. And we pulled at that time, I think it was a 5K MX chip when we had my red camera there. I think they're a 5K frame, so it must have been MX, not Dragon. We pulled a 5K frame from every lens, and we put them on a spreadsheet, juxtaposing them all together. And we had a resolution chart, a color chart, as well as out of focus, 20 feet away, Christmas lights, clear Christmas lights for looking at bokeh. And then we had a separate flare pass and looked at veiling glare and in-camera flares. But looking at each lens juxtaposed onto a page was a revelation. And it really changed the way I fundamentally cast my lens choices for my projects. Again, specifically in terms of what I was looking at in terms of contrast and manipulating the look of a project. How creamy do I want it? How nostalgic do I want it to feel? How dreamy or whatnot? And understanding, looking at this juxtaposition of all of these different lenses, I could be like, oh, I really like the look of a Cooke Series 2 Speed Panchro. I think there we go. This is very interesting for me, how it milks out the image. Looking at the bokeh, how a little bit of actual occlusion at the borders or a little bit of coma, another aberration that is a defect of ray tracing, basically. So that test alone was like, this is amazing to look at and actually be able to decide my lens package based on this test. But also, we need to learn more. We're just scratching the surface of what's going on here. And I wanted to get to a point where I could look at an optical design drawing and understand what the hell was going on. And at the beginning of this process, I thought that was going to be impossible. I couldn't look at all these different layout of lens elements and understand without getting into CAD programs and ray tracing software that actually does all these sort of lens calculations that used to take months to do with slide rules, and understand what's going to happen to the actual image, what are going to happen to the rays. Now, in this sort of a process that we've gone through and sort of try to break it down and make it relatable and understandable in lay terms, I'm a lot further down that path in looking at an optical design and be like, oh, okay, I can see that this is a modified double Gauss. I can see that they're actually increasing its angle of view by adding additional negative element in the front or whatnot, and understand, okay, this is dealing with aberrations. They're also putting in A-spheres into here to try to correct errors. And it's great to know. I mean, it does affect, certainly at the testing phase and the decision-making in those tests, what lenses I'm going to use on a project. Jay?
That was, oh, well, actually, you just sort of segued into one of the questions we wanted to answer, which is how do you cast a lens, or how do you choose a lens for a particular project? And how do you interpret the director's desire or intent into your lens choice?
Right. Well, if you take a case study of like, for example, like Mindhunter, one of the first determining factors that I was considering when I started to read the seasons of scripts was era. I knew that the entire series was going to span 3 decades. So then it was not only just like, okay, what are we going to do in designing the look of the show, specifically season 1, which was set in the 70s, from the mid to late 70s, but also then what can I do in terms of designing an arc, a visual arc that covers 3 decades of this evolution of these characters' storyline, which is based on real life characters, specifically John Douglas, who wrote the book Mindhunter, and who was a consultant for movies like Silence of the Lambs. He's an expert on serial killers, and these are the guys that actually defined the term serial killer. They were called lust murderers at the time. At any rate, era was a big determining factor, as I knew I wanted a certain contrast profile in terms of 70s. And it wasn't necessarily spoken in terms of that Fincher was interested in anamorphic, because that doesn't work for his sort of workflow processes in dealing with anamorphic glass of the 70s. There's too many errors and problems and distortion and aspects that don't work with his workflow in terms of how he stabilizes split frames and covers and manipulates the image in post. If you have to take away all those imperfections to be able to do a split frame and do focus pulls and recompose a shot and stabilize and reframe and retime camera moves, it becomes very problematic. But I think that was still an interesting aesthetic from that era in terms of the films that were made in the 70s, to kind of make an homage to that, to make it feel a little anamorphic. So that became a post effect workflow that the image went through, but we had to start with a very clean slate to begin with, in terms of the flatness of the field. So that started to guide us in terms of the lens choice, and we went with a very flat modern lens, with a much more telecentric design than a vintage anamorphic lens, which was the Summilux Cs. Also a factor in terms of casting that lens was the idea of the visual arc of, also, I knew that the actual path of the cameras would evolve over time, that you're going to have increases in sensor capability, sensor size, resolution sampling. So I said, okay, we're going to start the first season. We're with at that time, which was the Dragon sensor was the latest sensor. Helium was just coming out, but we wanted to have a larger sample size and be able to do reframing. So we shot 6K and framed for 5K within it. It gave him a border to be able to move around and recompose and retime tilts and things like this, and also do his split framing and be able to adjust the frame. So we needed a look around of at least 1K. So we were shooting Dragon, but I knew by the next season that 8K would be a thing, not 6K. And so not only did contrast change over the seasons, but resolution would change over the seasons, the number of samples we do, as well as color temperature. So what is the color rendering? What is the sort of color biasing that the lens introduces? It could be a factor. And for me, the 70s, two factors, parameters that I would use was that I would look for locations, or we would rebulb and try to deal with any night exterior with sodium vapor, which I felt would be very, very reminiscent of 70s and warmth and kind of this sort of tobacco stained feel of everything. All the characters are smoking, which also tied into why there's all the atmosphere in the sets. It's like they're all smoking cigarettes. It's sort of like a lot more warmer tones, as well as interiors. The bulb technology for a lot of these sort of corporate FBI headquarters stuff, I wanted to go with warm white fluorescence. So again, in the warm area, but with a touch of green. So we were trying to find enough stock of old warm white fluorescent tubes to do entire corridors of FBI headquarters that we built on soundstage, and finding enough of those bulbs. So 70s was sodium vapor, warm white, lots of smoke, tobacco stained, and a milkier contrast. So the Summilux lenses are actually not very warm, tobacco stained, which we can do in color correction and lighting choices, but they're also very high contrast and well performing. So I did some tests, and we actually determined that I would use a half low con filter on all the lenses. So we had custom 92 millimeter thread in low con screw filters that went right on the front of every lens. So when you took the lens out of the case and took the lens cap off and put it on the camera, it already had the low con built in. So you didn't even think about it. It was on every lens and was there. So that low contrast filter still influences and interacts with the ambient light, just as if it was a lower contrast lens. If it was just a performance of the optics, if there was a hot backlit window that would spread light, same thing as putting the filter on. I would prefer it in the optics, but it wouldn't work for our other aspects of editorial and post that we had a distorted milky lens that wasn't covering 6K and all these other factors. So that led to that choice. 80s, we would switch from the sodium vapor to mercury vapor, which is instead of an orange green, it was a blue green. And then to parallel that, instead of warm white fluorescence, it would go to cool white fluorescence, which still had a green component. And then the 90s would lose the green basically, and you'd go for night exteriors that were a little bit cooler without the green component, and then properly color corrected fluorescence above. Anyway, in terms of lenses, that was sort of all those influencing factors that dovetailed the resolution, the sample size, the contrast performance, the coloration, and veiling glare, and then the last thing on that was that in post, David introduced a little bit of barrel distortion, which is a kind of a hallmark of a vintage anamorphic glass, as well as the anamorphic streak flare, which are all post. We didn't put any streak filter or monofilament behind the lens to try to create that in camera on the day. He's got a very kind of dialed in post-production team that are very astute at adding those sort of parameters in post to taste. And actually Eric just did Eric Messerschmidt did a also similar little webcast on some of the season 2 aspects, and they even kind of doubled down on some of those anamorphic flares that he talks about. So that covers any Mindhunter questions, hopefully.
We had a whole breakdown on the cinematography of Mindhunter there.
Well, the idea is the thought process behind picking a lens, and so that is like a case study in terms of all those different aspects that led to that one decision. And that goes for any lens cast. I mean, although I've kind of been known as a little bit of a K35 nut, I don't use the same lens on every project. I really jump a little bit around everywhere. Like, I'm also a huge fan of anamorphic. I own Kowa and Atlas anamorphics, but I've done a number of projects where I've rented master anamorphics, the Aries Ice lenses, because that was the right optic for the job. The lack of the imperfections, the flatter field, the not the J.J. Abrams, shriek flares everywhere, but the anamorphic compression, the sort of sleight of hand magic that happens in the bokeh of the image with anamorphic, which we can actually get into a little bit. But again, I'm casting the optic to the job, and what is the actual parameters that I'm looking for. And using a vintage lens on tabletop, I learned, is not always the best idea, because if you have a lens that is rife with chromatic aberration and you're shooting a glass with hot edges and you're dealing with chromatic aberrations on a product, that could be a problem. So that can steer you in a different direction to avoid maybe using your Cook speed Pancros on a tabletop shoot, because you're going to deal with battling optical errors that you don't want to deal with. And maybe you want to go with a more modern lens that has those aberrations more controlled. You were looking at questions, Jay. So
yeah, I was looking at questions, and
a good segue.
Now we're going to make up the segue. Kind of want to do this 6 voted up question here. That's in the age of new full frame cameras, what are some good fast prime lenses? I've been a fan of the super speeds for the last few years, but their image circle doesn't quite cover sensors like the C500s Mark II. Converted Leicas or contacts, thanks in advance. So there's a lot of full frame options, and there's a lot of fast full frame options.
Even 2 years ago, there was not that many good options I was satisfied with, but that's changing. I think actually the Zeiss Supreme Primes are actually really nice, especially for their size and sort of form factor. They're almost, except for the very edges of the focal length range, T15, which is a very good working stop. I'm also was very impressed with the Lights Primes when they first debuted, and they are now delivering sets. So those are going to become more common out in the field. And although they are a little larger in size than, say, the Supremes, I do like the image of them quite a bit. The Lights Primes are really nice. And now we are at a partial set of the Optimos, which I only saw one focal length at the time when they had them at Cinegear last year. So there are more now, and I'd love to see what the whole range looks like. But there are a lot of options, even going into, CP2s and CP3s. I mean,
Gary Signature's Topina's Sigma.
Yeah, I mean, Sigmas, a lot of people were using Sigmas because they wanted to have a modern, fast, full frame lens. And I'm spoiled. I've been full frame the entire time with my K35s. So, and they are super fast. So that's another option if you're looking for vintage. But I will also go for something, more modern as well, if that's the kind of built into the look that I want to deal with. We've ignored the Lomo question for 2 sessions now. I know some people are very curious about that. My expertise in terms of Lomo is more in the anamorphic end, but obviously when the Iron Curtain existed, there was this effort in Russia to be able to have their own manufacturing of cameras and lenses. And they did quite well. I mean, they put Sputnik up before we got into space, and so that it's not that they're without technology, although a lot of times they sometimes cut little corners and stuff. And so what you see with a lot of the 50s, 60s glass in Russia is it's not that they're inventing a new frontier, is that they're ripping it off and knocking it off. So you will see a lot of the optical designs of Russia that are a copy and a derivation of a legacy or a current optical design that you'd see coming from Zeiss, for example. And certainly when they also split Germany and they had Oberkochen and Jena factories competing with each other as separate sort of entities, that only confused this sort of thing, because they were also sometimes working with the same optical design, but with 2 different sides of the political end of the manufacturing. And so those East Germany designs would trickle further east and into the Eastern Bloc, and you would see a lot of those designs copied and brought into specifically Lomo, the Lomo factory, which was the state backed initiative for making lenses. Unfortunately for me, again, a lot of the vintage glass kind of hits a wall for me because of the coverage issues. Is a lot of these lenses are not made for even Super 35 coverage in the 50s or 60s, or even earlier with like, Cook Speed Pancros 30s, 40s. So if I'm using these sort of like larger sensors to be able to vary my depth of field cues and my compression cues and all this sort of stuff that I kind of mix and match in designing my looks, if I'm limited to just shooting Academy, I feel like my hands are tied. So I haven't, the Lomo sphericals, for example, are, generally Super 35-ish. With any of these sets, when you get into longer focal lengths, just by a function of the optical design, the coverage tends to increase. So even if you have a set of lenses that were made for 16 millimeter, by the time you get into, if they go up to like a 50 millimeter in Super 16, it very well may be covering Super 35. Similarly, lenses for 35 millimeter Academy, some of the Baltars, once you get up to 100 mil, are actually covering 65 millimeter. Yeah. Even though they're made for Academy, not even Super 35, but it's like, you can use this on medium format or I can use it on 16 millimeter. It's up to you. And so testing obviously helps. The one caveat is that when manufacturers were buying lens heads from Cook or from Bausch & Lomb with Baltars or something like that, a lot of them would provide their own housings to work with their cameras. So Arri would buy a lens head from Cook, and they could put a Speed Pancro into an Arri housing with an Arri standard mount, or Mitchell could buy them and put them into a Mitchell housing, and it would have a BNC mount or BNCR mount. And so you would have the barrels sometimes made by the camera manufacturer, and then just buying the lens heads from the lens manufacturer. This is more like in the 50s and 60s than 70s. It got more specialized by that point. The point being is that if they're only targeting Academy or Super 35, they weren't worried about extended coverage. So they could limit the lens by function of the barrel design. And there was a trend early on in Cine lenses all the way up until almost the early 80s, is trying to make the lenses as small as possible. So you had all these little diminutive little Schneiders and little Zeisses that you would do a standard mount and put on your turreted Arri QC and fit 3 lenses on a camera because they're all tiny, and then had these little compressed focus scales. And that, I think that served people at the time when they were shooting at deeper stops and critical focus was less of an issue, as well as they wanted this sort of economy because they had to fit all this stuff into blimp housings, and they needed small lenses to fit into a big blimp housing that turned the camera into a washing machine on a dolly, So all those factors played into the actual design of the mechanics. The lighting style, the stops, the blimps, all that sort of stuff. So that changed in the 70s and became more specialized. And you still see it in terms of like the B speed, super speeds. I mean, those are still very small, slightly compressed scales, smaller scales. And then when you get into like the Mark 1s and Mark 2s, suddenly the barrels get a little bit bigger. They get into uniform 80 millimeter fronts. They get larger focus rotations up to the point where you have 350 rotation by the last generation of Mark 2s and into Mark 3s. That trend of having expanded focus scales for more resolution of rotation tracks with the cinematography trends of shooting more wide open, playing with the depth of field, not having to cram it into a blimp housing because the cameras became quieter. The Panaflex was a big leap forward in terms of a self-blimped quiet camera. And then also simultaneously the Panaflex, just shortly after that, you have the BL, and certainly by the BL3, it got even more quiet. Then by the 80s, you're into, Panaflex golds and platinums and Arri 535s, and it's super quiet film cameras. So that was less of an issue, and you could lose the blimp housing or the lens blimp housing, and the lenses can get bigger. Now we're getting into optics that are primes are, the size of a zoom that used to be. But all of that sort of stuff is kind of what we try to put a context into and understand the historical evolution of what was all these factors and how does that influence both optical design, but mechanical design, and what was going on in all these different aspects. So to get back to the Lomos, I mean, the coverage is still kind of locked with that format, as well as unless you have them completely rehoused. There are several companies that are rehousing Lomos. GL Optics in China does a full set of Lomo sphericals. There is Van Diemen in England that also does Lomo work. Specifically, they are rebuilding the anamorphics, the square fronts, and making them semi-round front by taking the squares and encompassing them into a round barrel and modernizing them, which is nice. And sometimes even replacing the rear prime with a different optic. So you can make a Lomo more like a vintage C series, for example. You're using the cylinder, the anamorphot group, which is the front block of the distortion elements that create the compression, and then replacing the back end with the Lomo spherical and throwing in a Cook Speed Panchro, which was the prime that was behind the C series, or even similar to the Tadeos or the JDCs. They all were using the primes that were available at that time. Typically not purpose building their own primes. So Lomo were using their own Lomo primes. Panavision had their own primes, as well as they were throwing in some other manufacturers' primes like Baltars or Cook Speed Panchros, specifically with the C series. But if you weren't in the Panavision game in the early 70s, then there wasn't very many choices. And an offshoot came out through Japan. Japan was very enamored from even the 1950s in anamorphic, and started doing, black and white anamorphic samurai films and all this sort of stuff. And so one of their powerhouse optical manufacturers was Kowa. And so they started dabbling in making projection lenses as well, and then had even a knockoff of Panavision's patent on how they dealt with the mumps situation. And they started making anamorphic primes, and by the early 80s had a very compact, small anamorphic lens with their BS series, which I own a set of those, which I'm a big fan of because they're small, fast, and flary and creamy. Besides Kowa, there's one manufacturer in Japan who was making cylinders. Specifically, this old guy, and for a period, his brother had a small little master craftsman workshop shed where they would make anamorphic cylinders, and they would do it by hand and grind and polish these cylinders to a recipe, which utilized a variable diopter front focusing solution to deal with the mumps issue, but also they made the cylinders for a number of glasses. So there was two manufacturers that did rehousings for people. And one of them was a Sinew Vision, which was Fukuzawa, was a Japanese lens technician who had a camera shop in Japan, in Tokyo, and he started assembling lenses for an order. So he was involved with people like JDC, or no, JDC was Yamada, with Technovision or some Tadeo stuff. So you have, and Sinew Vision obviously was a brand of that. So you have the cylinders were made by this Japanese master named Shiga, okay? And so you'll hear like Shiga Anamorphics and stuff like that. That's the dude, the 90-year-old guy in a shed polishing and grinding glass cylinders and selling those cylinders to be rehoused by Fukuzawa and making Technovision or JDZ or whatnot, or Tadeos or whatever Japanese knockoffs of these. And then they were also used in Nippon scopes, as well as a number of other little Fuji scope. I mean, there's a myriad options of these Japanese designs. And so that was the only other option, really, to have anamorphic glass in the 70s, besides Panavision. I mean, there was legacy French glass that was made in the 50s, but it didn't migrate as much to the US as it did into Europe, specifically France and Italy. A number of jobs, films, hundreds in fact, were shot with like Total Vision or Total Scope, which were the same company, just branded for different regions, as well as like Fran Scope. And these are all derivations of the predecessor design, the actual grandfather of all of these, which was Henry Kretion, who designed the first anamorphot to be put into motion picture application in the traditional sense of the 2-time squeeze, the horizontally compressing, which was his patent was from 1927. There was other alternatives. They were even predate that were doing vertical stretches and all this sort of stuff, or half frame, but to kind of be,
more distortion effects than actual compression to be
more possible. It's generally accepted that Kretion was the kind of the grandfather of the contemporary anamorphic process. Some co-workers of Kretion also formed other companies like Franscope or Total Scope, and so they used a similar anamorphot design and built their own lenses in France. And those lenses are still out there and actually are being also restored and trickled around. But Japan had a big contingent on that and are responsible for a number of these lenses, like all the JDCs that Joe Dutton was making in the late 70s into the all through the 80s, which Crystal Express for sure. And they had different generations of those where they used Coke Speed Macro back primes, or they used Zeiss Contax lenses behind there to have a faster set of them. And you'll see, like, it's virtually the same stuff. You have the JDC versus the Technovisions of that era. It's the same stuff. It's the same cylinders, same taking primes, same dude assembling them, different badging, maybe even a different mechanical barrel design, but same optics. So very similar. And then even the generations of the Todd AOs. There was a different optical design in some Todd AOs. Some of it used the Panavision focusing solution. Some of it used Richard Vedder's patented focusing solution. And other ones were just variable diopter. So it depends on which generation. I don't think we need to go into all the different versions of all these different lenses. It's explained in depth ad nauseum and breaks down all the different optical designs of how they grapple with anamorphic. But be that as it may, there's all these different lens sets that are out there and that are being repurposed and stuff. So they do exist. Panavision bought JDC in the 2000s and acquired all of their inventory. So if you're looking for Crystal Express lenses, chances are the lion's share of them are in Panavision England, where most of those lenses with JDC existed. But JDC did also sell lenses to other private owners, whereas Panavision, except for a small window when they first started making the Auto Panatars, they don't sell C-series. They never have. So you can't
sell any of their.
I only know of 2 sets that are owner-operated of Panavision lenses. Other than that, you have to get Panavision glass from Panavision. But you can get JDCs, or you can get Koas, or you can get Franscopes, or all these other lenses exist, and you can own them. And I own Koas, for example. We're talking historical right now, not the new wave of contemporary anamorphic glass that's flooding the market literally daily. That you have to keep up with, and we can touch upon that.
Atlas Orions and Cooks and Glassworks.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. So those are available to be purchased and owned besides being a rental house.
So you've been listening to the audio version of the Cine Lens Manual as read by Christopher Probst, ASC. We've hit our 1 hour mark, but we're going to hang out. And as long as you guys hang out with us and you're still interested and people aren't running away screaming, we're going to keep going and keep trying to answer questions here, and got some stuff to play with.
Why don't you scroll through and talk and find some questions, and we can just start to address some specific, and I will try not to ramble. Good luck with that.
Well, it was an amazing amount of information, but yeah, I went and made a sandwich and had a.
You need a little cutout of yourself so that like it looks like you're there, and you just swap it in when I'm not looking. Oh, there's Jay. Yeah. And then you come back and you swap it out.
Like the Mission Impossible, they just do the still frame and superimpose it.
You know what?
What are the questions?
I'm looking at a question now, and we had a question also that sort of dovetails. The question on a previous session was, what do you think about where the future of lenses are going to go, with a specific nod to the custom tuning? And then this question is also what is my take on or our take on Blackwing lenses? I think, for the near foreseeable future, putting an optic on a camera and capturing that is still going to be the means of storytelling. I don't think we're going to have some sort of, temporal brain capture and you just walk around with your eyes and undo the idea of a lens and a camera capturing something. So until that happens and we have some sort of, microwave Bluetooth connection to our brains and we're lensing with our eyeballs and eliminating the camera as an acquisition format, we're going to be dealing with lenses. So yes, I do think we're going to stabilize to a large degree in terms of this sort of wild west of variable formats. And I think we've kind of already started to do that with settling into full frame. Like I said, full frame represents a sweet spot in terms of what I like to do in terms of depth of field without battling a larger format and having to try to get more stop because I have too little, as well as it represents a sweet spot in terms of optical design, what you can do in terms of designing a lens for that format size and still have speed, compact, cost of manufacture, size of lens, all these different parameters. Full frame is kind of like, it's definitely been around. So there's a lot of manufacturing muscle that's already built into that that format size and building optics for that. We have, I don't know what the current Canon count on actual 35 millimeter still glass is, but it's like 500 million of actual lenses delivered in 35 mil. So there's a lot of lenses that are already built for the format, and Cine lenses represent a small portion of that optics that have been made over the last century. So I think
we'll want to talk about the majority of optics. It's these things.
Oh, well, that's a whole nother area. Yeah, and that's getting better too. But in terms of like an actual camera and a lens, interchangeable lens, and I don't think next year we're going to be mounting iPhones exclusively and making, the next Christopher Nolan movie. That's not happening immediately. That not to say that it won't have ever happen, or we may not have some sort of wireless connection to our brain and we just capture that way. But I think, settling into this sort of full frame imager size and optic, I think that's going to stabilize. And as well as when Arri finally releases their 4K Super 35 sensor, I think you'll see a resurgence also of legacy Super 35 glass. You'll see master primes and ultra primes and super speeds have an uptick in usage and really embracing those lenses for what they are, which are great. And Cook S4s or whatever that weren't designed for full frame, but are still beautiful lenses and highly usable to this day. And they're still
not going to become obsolete, is what you're saying. We're not.
No, in fact, they'll become more relevant because when people realize that now we can still capture the 4K, but we don't have to jump to a larger imager and deal with a larger camera. Like, the LF is a physically larger camera. Now that's why the Mini is so popular, because it takes off a lot of the stuff, but you lose a lot of functionality. So then you want to have to strap stuff onto the thing because you pulled all the functionality out of the camera and now you're having to strap stuff on. So I've seen camera builds that are just like complete spaghetti bowl monstrosities. It's like, why are you using this camera? Like, it's modular, but not really. And then you're having to add all this other stuff on and it becomes a mess. Just use the larger format that has the more video outputs, that has the motors built in and the connections for wireless already built in. And it's bigger, but it's also cleaner build. And that's something that would drive, Fincher absolutely bonkers. So once we stabilize in terms of the format and all that sort of stuff, again, one of the frontiers is this sort of adjustability, this tunability, which what the book will help you understand is that what they are adjusting is all the things that we are slaving to define and explain, which is aberrations, which is imperfections. Specifically with a lot of the tuning, when they start moving optical spacing, they are inducing, by and large, are trying to induce a degree of spherical aberration. I don't think anyone's trying to induce chromatic aberration. No one wants that. But by moving a few thousandths of an inch, you can throw off the performance of a lens and induce spherical aberration that smooths out that bokeh. And that could be a desirable thing. And they will call it, oh, this is X tuning, or this is, whatever sort of layman's terms that they don't want to sort of give up the ghost of what they're doing and just say, oh, this is the dream tuning, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But what they're doing is inducing an aberration. And
Well, the conflict there is that for forever, the goal was to create lenses that performed better, that had better contrast, that had better resolving power. And optical designers are trying to eliminate these imperfections. And then you get creative artists that are embracing the older lenses that have imperfections in them, and there's a conflict.
yeah,
So
drives
the
the
manufacturers that are,
bonkers.
what's that?
Drives the engineers bonkers. You talk to a Zeiss
Yeah.
guy, and they'll be just like an addict scratching at their skin, saying, "You want what? Oh, we just spent the last century trying to figure out how to undo all this stuff, and you want it back." Okay, great. I'll just jump on.
So now manufacturers are making lenses that give you the option. In one lens, you can get the high performance, or you can kind of fudge it and detune it and get more character and more faults built into it. And that's what I've been telling manufacturers for years that they should be doing is give me one lens that can do a bunch of different things.
Yeah, Panavision has been offering this service by default in terms of trying to help the cinematographer pick a lens set they want, and they would go back and kind of surreptitiously do their own little tweaks and say, well, how does this look like? Yes, that's it. And then they would match that to the entire set. But that's not really like a user defined or interchangeable on the set. You have lenses coming out now like the Agenu Optimo primes, which are building in that custom tunability by the user and not a lens technician. To a degree, the Blackwings are like that. I think, for the general audience, they're not going to be, replacing elements themselves and swapping stuff out. But, but
in the Blackwings,
more savvy owner operator could possibly, retune their own lenses, like with the Blackwings, for example. But there are aspects
of the
of
Clavius, the
exact
dog shits, but the Clavius, I mean, these are all highly aberrant, highly characteristic.
You mean the Trump, the dog shit Trump?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. They're not making any word associations or political affiliations at all.
Well, that's what they're called.
It's true. It's true. So I think that covered a little bit in terms of the Lomo and the tunability. Do you want to scroll through and see if there's something else that will guide a?
There's one question here that had a bunch of votes on it, which is what mechanical traits are you looking for in a lens in the first place? You were talking about TLS. What made you choose them over others? And when talking about rehoused vintage optics, which features are you looking for when you're looking at the housings? Serviceability, reliability, uniformly spaced focus marks, unified geared positioning, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, all of that.
I added the yada, yada.
First and foremost, obviously, is sort of a mechanical performance that is repeatable, reliable, and accurate. Meaning you don't want to be dealing with lost motion. So when you're coming from infinity and you focus to 6 feet, and you look at the mark on the lens, it's one mark. But then if you come from minimum focus and go and focus on a chart at 6 feet, it comes up as a different mark. That's actually gear lash, where you're coming from this side, it's on this side of the gear. Let's see if I can get my fingers close. But when you come from the other direction, it's this way. So that's slop in the gearing. That's typically with like a helical thread, but it could also be in the cam follower. Could be a little looseness. So you don't want to have lost motion. That's a mechanical issue. I certainly want to have an awareness of the coverage of the lens. If there's an ability to rehouse a full frame lens, I want to make sure that they don't restrict the coverage in the process of doing a rehousing. I've dealt with rehousers, or like they were using older projectors to check the lenses and stuff they didn't have a larger format reticle. So you really need to have like a Cruzeal or something that will cover like a 65 reticle. And then you can look at where is it optically occluding, vignetting the image circle that lens could have. Because I know it's a full frame lens, but now we've cut the corners at, 32 millimeters. Well, don't do that. I need to always
the rear cone or the front lip or
yeah.
Something
so
that
having an awareness of that is important mechanically. A uniformity in focus scale is nice, and I think it's good for like camera systems to have this sort of feel of what is the rhythm of the turn. If you can keep that uniform throughout the set, typically that is not the case. You will have
it's a very new thing.
a much larger scale on longer lenses than you will on shorter lenses. So that rhythm has changed now with the Summilux lenses, Ian Neal and the designers when they did the Leica Sonder optic or lights now, they were able to try to make the lens scale all the way from infinity to 6 feet, the same throw, the same distance of all those marks. But then after 6 feet, that's variable per focal length. Obviously, focal lengths that are closer to each other will probably have a similar throw. But
you mean before 6 feet?
Yeah,
minimum focus distance is 6 feet. Yeah.
But after 6 feet and deeper, it's definitely they actually won an Academy Award on that. But about trying to keep that focus scale more consistent throughout this set. Kristen J, what are your impressions of Tim's Masterbuilt Tokina Mod lenses? In terms of,
I'm happy that they said Tokina Mod.
Yeah, well, that's something that is not readily publicized, and I feel is a little bit deceptive. It's been intimated that by Tim that he designed it and came up with a prescription. I think these are deceptive language being used. He did not create the prescription for that optical design, nor did he design the lens. He modified a lens. He bought them from Tokina and has modified them, specifically coatings, and then
both optically and mechanically.
Strip the coatings off the barrels to remove all of the Tokina badging, and then call them Masterbuilt. And regardless of the fact if you like the look of them, I think you have to be honest in terms of this is a $5,000 lens that I'm now charging $12,000 for because I've recoded a certain number of elements or surfaces and rebadged it. As long as you're aware of what you're getting into when you're buying a $25,000 lens set and paying $70,000 for the set to be recoded, fine. But by intimating that you designed the lens or that you created the prescription of, I do not disagree. I do not condone that. And I know a lot of people are excited by these lenses and what he's offering, which is great, as long as you know what you're getting going into it and you don't feel deceived.
I think the look of what he's created from what I've seen is really nice. The result is excellent. The sort of deceptive process of not telling people actually where the origin of these came from is very frustrating.
He's actually done something really good, and he should be proud of that and stand behind the work and the service he's performed. Because first off, the base optic of the Tokina lenses is great. I mean,
it's an extraordinary design. It's a really, really refined optical design.
Let's not diminish that contribution because Tokina have done something really amazing. And for the price point, especially, I mean, these are multi-A-sphere, multiple element designs that are fast and flat. And it's an impressive achievement that the Tokina engineers and designers have achieved. And then to try to take credit for that and say, I created the prescription. No, Tokina did a really good job and should be applauded. They even tried to do their own slightly less coated version of it, but it just it didn't go far enough. And what Tim did is he took that and he did go further and try to imbue a look with those lenses, working off of this really elegant optical design and then sort of cleverly, deceptively marketing them. I just wish there was more transparency in his marketing. I don't think there's any reason why it should not divulge where your optic is coming from. That just irks me.
There's a question in here. Any truth that Leica R and Summilux, Leica R, Summilux, and Summicron have a very different look? And which medium format lenses would be a good investment? Two very different questions.
There are a lot of Leica aficionados out there who, by and large, a lot of people prefer the Crons. The look of the Crons. It's a slightly different. Obviously, it's a different optical design. It's not a fast double Gauss modified F1.2 or F1.3, 1.4 optical design. They're targeting just at F2, and so that simplifies things to a degree.
The naming convention with Leica is related to the speed.
Correct. Yeah.
So the Summicron is one speed, the Summa Lux are the faster speed, and then the Noctilux are the super fast speed.
Yeah, and then there's Elmarit. There's a whole slew of different speed families. But crons and Simuloxes are, a popular cine-modded or rehoused optic from like our glass. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people like the look of the crons. The sort of basic, less floating element, less asphered, kind of refined F2 design. Produces a very pleasing image, a rounded, kind of creamy. The Leica coatings are very popular. You actually have a Simulux there, I think, right? So that's
I do. That's what I was just putting on here. With the wooden camera PL to EOS mount here, which I'm actually loving quite a bit.
Very nice. So Jay's got a couple of my lenses on loan so he can do lens tests and drive me bonkers with late night PDFs and posts of his lens rumination findings. But so there's something to be said, and this is the newer kind of frontier I've been dabbling with, is like when you simplify an optical design, there are certain benefits or trade-offs you have when you start to try to like eke out more and more speed out of an optical design and get into f1.2 designs versus an f1.8 or a f2. And so that's kind of the line of demarcation between Simuluxes and Simulacrons, for example. I've been dabbling with even going a little older into 60s rangefinder glass. One of the aspects that affected optical design greatly for Cine was the spinning mirror on the camera to create a reflex camera. By having that mirror behind the lens, it forced the optics to have to move away from the sensor, from the film plane. And by moving it away, you're having to throw the focus further. And that becomes a problem. And it created the need to have what is called a retro focus design, which is actually shifting the optics further away from the film plane than the focal length would have to throw. That increases the complexity of the optical design. It diminishes the actual light performance because of the function of the inverse square law of the light diminishing over distance, as well as it creates an entocentric design where it has to spread the rays further to cover the image format, all those sort of things. Rangefinder glass does not deal with any sort of reflex viewing. So all the optics are shifted closer to the imager and don't have to deal with the aspects of retro focus design and throwing in more glass to try to make the optics go further away and have a mirror either articulating for a still camera or a spinning mirror for a motion picture camera interrupt the light path between the lens and the collector. So rangefinder glass, as a function of that, is much more compact, sits much closer to the imager, which is actually deeper into the camera, but also a more simple design from the time that it sort of predates the popularity of floating designs as well as incorporating A-spheres. Although A-spheres existed in that time frame of the 50s and 60s, they weren't as readily popular. In fact, Canon was one of the big proponents of utilizing A-spheres in mass production of glass with the FDA sphericals, specifically the AL 55, which was designed in 71, and into the FDA sphericals in 75, and into the L glass now, incorporating aspheric lenses into mass production was a big thing that Canon kind of perfected.
Which, of course, became the K35. There's a lot of like, talk FDs, K35.
We did that last time, too. They can go review it. The point being is that the rangefinder glass doesn't have any of that, but it sits closer in. And that affects two things. Because the glass sits closer, when you're dealing with using rangefinder glass on a PL mount, for example, the throw of the PL mount is 52 millimeter. But if the rangefinder glass wants to throw, I'm going to give you an arbitrary number, 15 millimeters. Now the glass has to still sit at the 15 millimeters, but the PL mount has to sit at 52 for the flange. So that forces all the optics inside the PL mount. So then how do you work the mechanics inside the PL mount for focus and iris controls when it's all nestled in? That creates what's called a pancake lens, where the actual, you mount it and then the lens is like this big. It's a pancake versus, so here we go. This is an ingenue 50 millimeter 0.95. And you can see here's the PL, but then the optics are sitting almost another inch back. So this actually, the sensor is going to sit very close, right? That's because this lens has a very deep throw. So in certain cameras, you can't even mount this on if it has a spinning mirror, but it sits very deeply. Similarly, the Canon Dream lens, the 50 millimeter 0.95. Now this is actually an M mount, like an M mount. So when this goes in, the M mount is much more shallow. And so the optics are sit much closer. If I were to, there's a 35 millimeter 1.5 rangefinder lens. Again, this is going to sit about this far from the imager plane. But if I were to try to PL mount it, it would be out here, right? And that means that all this optics, look how far this glass is sitting inside the barrel. It's very deep. So that means if you PL mount this, it would be all the glass is literally inside the PL mount. There is no front barrel. And it becomes very almost impossible to PL mount certain lenses. They had a demo of the Dream lens, the 50 millimeter, at Cinegear last year that was in a PL mount. But if you actually try to articulate the iris, it didn't work. It was disabled. Sure, they got the lens crammed inside a PL mount, but there's no way to actually build the mechanics to control the iris. So the iris was just stuck.
Who needs that?
Zero Optic, Alex Nelson at Zero Optic opted to go with an M mount here. And so I have an M mount for my camera, and I can put these on, and I'm building a whole set of 60s rangefinder glass off of M mount. So if I'm doing a film and I want to use these, I just put M mounts on all the cameras, and we put it on, and we can positive lock it, and it's great. And these lenses are gorgeous. Conversely, you can go with a shorter flange depth of like the LPL mount. So TLS have done the same lens, the 50 millimeter Canon Dream lens, in LPL mount, which has a shorter flange depth than the PL mount, and you're able to still not have a complete pancake. This is shorter than that. And there are some particularly beautiful lenses of this era that I'm very excited to play with once I get the whole set done. So I'm always thinking a couple of years ahead of what I'm actually trying to rehouse and rebarrel and get going. So I mean, I'm building this set, but I still can't shoot it with only 3 lenses. You know, I'll get another 2 in a week or so from Alex, the 85 1.5 and the 100 f2, which are both really pretty lenses that he just recently posted on the.
And Nelson is out there going, "Oh my God, okay, next week."
Yeah, we do these talks, and then he gets flooded by more work orders, so he's definitely going to be backed up till rapture with the lens rehousing projects. And why? Because people are recognizing that there's different optical qualities in legacy glass that maybe is appealing to them besides just the modern. I span the gamut. I play with all of it because, again, I like to have different properties for different projects, but I don't disregard the vintage glass. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff. So I kind of I'm interested in owning and building stuff that I can't readily get at any rental house. Like, I'm not going to spend $500,000 assembling an entire Lights Prime set. I like the lenses fine. I think I'm going to use them, but to own them, I want the stuff that I can't find anywhere. I want to trick out. I want to customize. I want to make stuff. And I was the first guy to build an entire FD set. And now those have gone completely haywire and bonkers, and the prices have skyrocketed. So at a certain point, I don't even want to tell you what I'm up to from 2 years from now, because you guys are going to skyrocket the pricing of what I'm still trying to buy. And that happened with the K35s. I started shooting them in the mid 2010s and started putting up all these videos of Taylor Swift, and like, oh, I shot these with K35s, and people, this looks amazing. And suddenly the prices have gone completely haywire, and you can't find them anywhere.
Which is, it's funny because if you talk to some of the old school cinematographers who were, at the pinnacle of their career at the time that the K35s were released, they were not necessarily a big fan. They did not really like those lenses at all because there was too much character. Why do I want a lens that looks like this?
Well, yeah,
people are hungry.
Yeah, well, you have to cast it also. Film stock at the time was also a factor, and it was also on a parallel course of trying to build in more performance, more sharpness, more contrast, and also having to deal with the photochemical processes of negative, interpositive, internegative print. So, you know, that built up contrast. So like if the film trend was like, okay, earlier films were much more contrasty, and then you had, you know, you had all this contrast that is built up into the actual print process, and it would look pretty harsh. So the trend in film was to try to get softer and softer contrast of film stocks with more sensitivity and finer grain, and then have a very sharp lens, and then deal with. And certainly by the time that, like in the early 2000s, when like you eliminated the photochemical process for by and large the majority of Hollywood films that were now doing a DI and spitting it out of a computer and laser recording it, you lost all those steps of degradation of generation and accumulated contrast in the print processes. Suddenly it's like, oh, now we can use a milkier lens, which is when you did that, when you put that on in the film process, like K35s weren't a popular choice. And more so, they migrated more to England, I think, than they ever did to Hollywood, although we've labored to try to find examples of when they were used. And I'm not going to divulge all the credits that we've accumulated so that everyone else will know. That's part of our book marketing, so you'll have to wait. But there are some really interesting credits that actually use those lenses very celebratedly. Yeah, so now with digital imagers, where you're really using a high resolution sampling and actually recording all those characteristics and imperfections and nuances of a lens in a digital format, people are really responding to that. Like I'm a huge fan of the Netflix show The Crown, which they use Cook Speed Pancrose series 2, series 3, and to beautiful effect. You know, the veiling glare, the flares that they use, the atmosphere, the tonal rendering. I mean, it's a gorgeous looking show. And that's using, you know, 60, 70-year-old lenses on a digital.
That kind of dovetails into one of the questions I saw when I was scrolling down, which is, do higher resolution or higher photosite count sensors, are they a benefit or a detriment in lens character? And I think a lot of people misunderstand this concept, and they think that a higher photosite count sensor, which relates to higher resolution or higher resolving power in the sensor, equals more sharpness. And that's not true.
Or worse, harshness.
Right, right.
Hear about the digital edge. This term has been kind of bandied about. And there's actually examples ad nauseum out there that actually disprove that. And this is a trickle down from the early digital formats of HD camcorder technology that first came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, of where you had a digital motion picture camcorder, for all intents and purposes, that dealt with 3CCD, which had a big prism block behind these lenses that was 2/3 inch size and had a different sort of focusing of all the different rays of colors that was split via a prism. And super sharp on the red channel. There's a certain diffusing that happens on a film recording where the light passes through the different layers and will get slightly softened. The red was always a slightly murkier layer, and then the blue was the blue yellow was always the rear one. It was always the grainiest because it was at the back of the film. It was always slower. All that sort of stuff did a certain softening to the image, and similarly the 2/3 inch HD chips were heavily post sharpened in camera. And so when people started shooting HD, they saw all this sharpening. And there are examples of taking a low resolution image and sharpening it and having a high resolution image that's not sharpened, where if you look at them side by side, the high resolution image looks soft because of contrast and edges and not of resolution. There's actually, you know, it can be 4 times the resolution, but it is not sharpened and it does not have its contrast enhanced to look like it's sharp to your eye. So when you're looking at the same sort of distance, the low resolution but highly sharpened image looks edgier and looks sharper to your eye, but does not have more resolution. Sharpness, acutance, and resolution are separate concepts. So if you were to zoom in on the sharpened image and the high resolution image, you could push in and still have all this detail, and it looks in focus to your eye versus you would push in on a sharpened image and it would look chunky and edgy and contrasty and without detail, without resolution. So sharpness and resolution are not the same thing, and samples and resolution are not the same thing. So having a certain number of photosite count is certainly intertwined with being able to achieve a high resolution sampling, but resolution sample pixels, which is not the proper term, does not denote resolution. Sampling does not, because what is the scheme that is being sampled on? Every point on a sensor, with by and large, what we're using now is the Bayer pattern developed by Kodak, Dr. Bryce Bayer in the 70s, which is a color filter array, which at any given point on a sensor, you're only sampling one color of the three RGB. So you can either choose red or green or blue for that point. And then next to it, you may have a different color. So for a quadrant of four samples, let's say a checkerboard, you would have half your resolution, half of your samples specifically to the green color. So you'd have two greens on a diagonal to each other in a section of 4 squares. Then you would have your chroma, your red or your blue, have to split the last 2 samples. So you'd have a red one and a blue one. So you have 2 greens, a red and a blue. That's how the Bayer pattern works. So resolution and sampling are totally different, because what is the resolution of the green channel versus the resolution of the red and the blue? But that will deliver a demosaic image that will have a certain amount of resolving power built into it. But and then how much that equates to contrast and sharpness are, again, intertwined but separate concepts. You're looking for something, Jay?
Yeah, I was trying to pull up that resolution sample while you were talking about that. And
with the contrast and the sharpening?
Yeah, I'm struggling to get PowerPoint to work for me in this.
Right. The point being is that, all of these parameters versus the film stock or digital imager and resolution, and also, is this lens an 8K lens or is this lens a 4K lens, which is kind of a misnomer. Sure, there is MTF performance and sort of a resolving power that a lens can transmit, which is inherent to the measurements of MTF, which is what is the contrast versus spatial frequency that a lens can reproduce at a certain threshold where, is acceptable to be discernible between different bars of white or black on a chart, or, so if I have an 8K camera, can I put on an 80-year-old Series 1 Cooke Panchro? Is that an 8K lens? What that's going to do is it's going to take an image of that lens and reproduce every single nuance of that lens, because I'm sampling it very finely. If I only take 2 samples of a color, let's say I have a 4-pixel digital camera, and I want to take a photograph of a sunset sky. If I only have 4 samples, how am I going to resolve the millions of shades of colors of a sunburst sky, right? Versus if I sample that millions of shades, I can then define all those subtle gradations of color changes, right? So you need sampling to achieve resolution and color fidelity and range and tonality and all that sort of stuff. So by having more samples, if I put an old vintage creamy, flary, bloomy, whatever lens in front of it, I'm going to capture all of that in its essence. If I put a lower resolution, I'm going to truncate some of those qualities and not capture as much. The real debate about the K war is, where is that line of demarcation, or where is it enough? And I'm of one mindset, and other people are of another mindset. Steve Yedlin has done very detailed treatises on his take on where the threshold of resolution is. And I agree on some of his points, and I disagree on other of his points in terms of what is the threshold of what we need in cinema to experience an image that, one, feels in focus, or that has enough resolution to be sharp to our eye at a comfortable viewing distance. But my argument is also, what do we want to capture as our negative? What do we want to have in terms of workable information and detail and color reproduction? Because I already told you that we only have half of our samples in terms of a Bayer pattern sensor is green, and only a quarter by default left on red or blue. So if I'm only sampling at a 4K camera, I only have 2K of green and 1K of red and blue. So how is that camera a 4K camera? How is it going to reproduce a 4K image in that sample? Yeah, that sampling methodology. So where does it become, at parity? If I have a 16K camera, which we currently aren't shooting anything at 16K by and large, I'm sure NHK in Japan have it and are playing with it. But to get 4K on chroma, we need to have because we're at quarter resolution on our chroma in that mosaic scheme, that Bayer mosaic. I need to have a 16K Bayer chip to get 4K of red and 4K of blue samples. That gives me 8K on my green because it's half of the 16. But so we're not even there yet in terms of being agnostic, in terms of having a parity of sampling 4K and delivering 4K on chroma. But it's not that bad. But that's a whole separate argument in terms of digital technology. And we're here to talk about lens geekery. But it does play into this idea of MTF, of capturing and reproduction and tonality and color cast, and all these things are all intertwined. And so it's kind of hard to get the whole worldview with ignoring one aspect of it. So our idea is to try to understand every parameter and how it relates to one another, and make them all work in synergy with each other.
Kudos to the 95 individuals who have hung in with us for the hour 45 here. I think we'll probably shut it off about 2 hours, but we'll try to get a couple more questions in. Another one that was voted up a lot here is, and I saw a second question on this, which is Cook triplet technology. That's an interesting question, because the Cook triplet was designed in 1893. So when we're talking about Cook triplet technology, I'm not sure what that question really means, but it was a very extraordinary design at the time that Chris talked about symmetry earlier. That is a 3-element design. There's 2 positive elements and a negative element in between there.
It was asymmetrical.
And it is still symmetrical because there's a single center element, and then there's a balance of 2 positive elements on the other side of it. So it is a balanced. It's not like weighing to one side or the other, or adding 3 elements to one side of the stuff. I
guess what I'm saying is it's not mirrored in terms of you'd have the 3 lenses and then mirror the other 3, which would be similar to like a double gloss design. I'm not sure if there is a mirrored Cook triplet design out there. That would be interesting to figure out.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I'm not sure that would work. But what you're talking about is a very simple design that does still exist today, especially in inexpensive, like 50 millimeter still lenses. That some of them have a very simple 3-element design, and it's a very elegant design that at the time solved a lot of the aberrant problems. But again, we're talking about 1893. is when this was first introduced by Dennis Taylor,
and that optical formation actually has at its roots the presaging of the zoom lens. That negative element, by function of where it's placed, would actually change the magnification, and people realize, okay, I have this sort of idea. I have a group here, and a negative group here. If I move this around, I can change magnification. So instead of a single element of the Cook triplet, you can say this single element represents a group of elements, and this rear element represents a group of elements, and there's a negative group in the middle, and I can move these around, and that's the formation of a zoom lens.
Fundamental design of a zoom lens, yeah.
Pretty crazy. So you start to see the evolution of the ideas of the optical design, and then realizing how it applies and how you can use that. Going back even further, with Galileo, he adopted a configuration of a positive and a negative lens, and by changing the spacing, it changed the magnification, and you created what's called an afocal group, which is the formation of both afocal achromats, diopters, as well as the precursor of how anamorphic works. Is you have afocal groups that are doing compression, but they're also casting collimated rays, which is a whole another level of intricacy that's probably beyond the scope of what we could talk about right now. But you know, these optical designs go back hundreds of years and are still applied today.
There's one question in here: is Academy coverage of vintage lenses, is Academy 35 millimeter at 185? And no, the Academy standard was set when sound was introduced into film. So we're talking about 1931, 32, and it is a 1.33 to 1 aspect ratio. Actually 1.37 to 1.
Yeah, it got lopped to 1.3
film cade,
eventually.
Yeah. 1.37 in the camera, and then 1.33 for projection. And that is allowing for space for the soundtrack on the left side of the film. And that space was deleted or given back to the picture with Super 35. So when we talk about Academy 35, that is a smaller image area than Super 35, which used the full perf to perf, 4 perf area frame of 35 millimeter. So quick answer to that. Boom.
True that. All of that is also covered in the book because we can't ignore some of these historical context of the formats and the lenses that were made to support that format. So that's all a whole new chapter that was just created recently.
Just added more to the book.
You said 1,200 pages. Is that?
That's our current count, actually. Yeah.
God.
Yeah, we blew past that 800 a while back.
Oh, sorry, people. Next question, Jay.
Yes. No, sure. Let's see. Is there a recommended PL to M4T adapter that accepts traditional PL glass? Most standard PL tends to protrude and hit the glass element of the metabones one that I have. It's a very specific question, but I got voted up.
Wow. Way out of my wheel.
PL to micro 4/3. Yeah, the problem is if you're trying to put the metabones in there too, there is back focus issues on a lot of PL lenses that they are extending, like Chris was showing, beyond the flange point into the optics. That's a case-by-case basis.
You got to think about micro 4/3 because that imager target is smaller. You're going to tend to use wider lenses. Those wider lenses in PL tend to be retrofocus, which puts the optics even further back, sticking out of the back of the lens, which is going to run into the problem. So you're trying to use wider lenses because of the function of the actual format size, the target, the sensor size, the imager size, and that those lenses tend to have elements that stick out of the rear more. Telephotos tend to have the elements buried within the mount and not protruding at all. So the function of that imager size forcing you to use wider focal lengths, which also happen to protrude out of the back, is like this sort of perfect storm catch-22. Sure, you could put probably any telephoto on that adapter, no problem. But now, you're multiplying your focal length by the crop factor, the field of view equivalencies. So no one wants to use a 200 millimeter on micro 4/3. It's like, could be like a 500 mil equivalent to Super 35 or something. You don't want to deal with that. So yeah, you're probably a little bit SOL on that. And again, a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I don't dabble with micro 4/3 very much. Certainly being an owner operator with my red cameras and stuff like that. I shoot everything, but I'm definitely more familiar with going the other way in larger format, larger sensors.
What's our point of view on the emotional characteristics associated with some beautiful aberrations? Is it something that you plan according to the script, or is it something more visceral? Greetings from Chile. But I can answer that before Chris jumps in, and I think that it is both. Everything for me personally goes back to the script and goes back to the interpretation of the telling of that particular story. And like Chris talked in episode 1 of this, there is a casting of lenses and the characteristics and the feel of lenses. And it all goes back to an emotional aspect. These are very esoteric ideas. We can talk technically about what spherical aberration and chromatic aberration and coma and distortion do to an image. But what that does to the emotional impact is completely interpretive. So it's up to the individual artist, the cinematographer and the director, to say, yes, for this project and telling this story, I think the Cooke Pancrow and the feel of this lens gets what's in my head when I want to tell this story. Somebody else may look at that exact same story and say, no, the master primes are the way that I want to tell this story. And there's no wrong interpretation there. It's up to the individual artist as to say, this is my vision and this is how I want to get that vision across. So that's my answer to that, Chris, if you want to.
I was scrolling through some of these other questions and stuff, and apparently Dump was here and just signed off. And he had actually an interesting question that I was curious about what he was getting onto, but I'll have to text him about it.
Oh, was he in the Q? Oh, he was actually in the chat, wasn't he?
Yeah, the Q&A here, but I'll have to hit him up privately on that.
Oh, I see it. I see the mobile optics lenses, but
yeah, it's actually something that I've been investigating, and maybe he has some additional information. Like, I'm not sure I was aware of Kenji being involved with those, so I'll have to hit him up and see if he has some other information that I don't know about. I'm assuming he's talking about the Mitchell high-speed mobile lenses, which I've been investigating the Mitchell lenses quite a bit, so I'll have to look into that.
So we should actually shut this off in about 7 minutes here at the 2-hour mark. If you want to see if there's any last question or anything else we want to dive into. And again, thanks to all of the diehards who stuck with us for 2 hours on this.
Right. Let's see here. There was a couple.
Chris and I could actually talk for days. Well, as anybody can see, Chris can talk for days. I can also talk for days.
I did kind of commandeer all this sort of stuff. I think I talked about both of these here. Wait for a project. Oh, here's something here in terms of the idea of they asked me about creaminess, but they also talked about 3D pop. We didn't touch about that last time, and we posted a link in the comments last session.
Yeah, to the Hurlbut test.
Yeah, which I think is actually, if you actually can kind of latch onto what he's seeing, you start to. It's very interesting to see the difference between I think it was a Cooke S4 and a Sumilux C is what he was comparing in his test, and one was much more kind of a built-in barrel geometric distortion, and one was much more flat field and slightly more telecentric, where you have a flattening of the actual image space, which was interesting. And he felt that the sort of a little bit of barrel distortion lended a dimensionality to the image, where it felt like the subject area was pulled forward in the sort of image space that you were seeing as a 2D projection, but it felt like they were pulled out of their environments in a dynamic 3-dimensional way, and it felt like your eye latched onto what the subject was more than it being kind of a flat field presentation of that same focus plane.
I thought this was very, on that topic, that this was very interesting. These are some of the images from the Share Grid Old Fast Glass Ultimate Full Frame Lens Test of model Corey here. And I put this into American Cinematographer Shotcraft in July. This is K35, 35 mil. Let's see if I can get this to jump ahead. There we go. And this is a Thalia, 35 mil. And you can see from the exact same distance, the exact same focal lengths, a completely different rendering of her face shape. And I thought that was a very interesting explanation or example of how different lenses and different optical designs, even of the exact same focal length at the same distance, relate back to face shape and 3D pop and geometrical representation of the world.
Yeah, there's a lot of a confusion surrounding perspective and compression distortion, which is separate from the idea of geometric distortion of a lens and what that creates. But by and large, what we mostly grapple with on a day-to-day basis when we're choosing focal lengths is what is the perspective we want to see, and why do we shy away from using a wide angle lens very close versus using a little longer lens further back for a face? And that has to do with perspective and distortion relative to the camera placement. And you can shoot that wide angle lens from further away and crop in, and it will have the same compression of the background as the longer lens. It's just how you crop it. The lines of perspective are the same for any focal length from the same distance. It's not going to change. But when you cram in, if the focal length is longer, it may be a tighter shot, but the distortion may be equal as alarming as putting a 20 millimeter 1 foot away. You could put a 100 millimeter 1 foot away. The distortion will be the same, but you may only see the tip of the nose, but that distortion is the same there.
It's all about relative distance of the camera to the subject.
Correct. Yeah. And that's something,
and relative distance of the objects.
And this is something that also people like would grapple with, like, it not only the perspective and distortion, but depth of field. Then, like, well, let's put an 85 millimeter on and back up the camera. It's like the depth of field is going to be exactly the same. If the shot size is the same and the iris is the same, the depth of field is going to be the same, whether you're on a 50 millimeter or 100 millimeter twice as far away. So the only thing you're going to get different is the perspective is different, the compression, how much are you punching into this middle of this image versus seeing. And
your field of view of your background will diminish by the 100 millimeter lens. There is a magnification difference, but yeah, the depth of field does not change.
I like to, as a concept in terms of focal length, is more of a function of relative distance of camera to subject of perspective than it is of some sort of optical squeezing. That's the misconception in terms of, like, when you use this term, like, oh, it's more compressed, like, you use a longer lens, more compressed. No, you're actually just cropping in from that further perspective, a smaller field of view, a tighter window field of view, but the perspective lines are the same. So I can march the camera in and get the same field of view, but now my perspective lines are completely different. And that's going to change the camera to subject relationship and the distortion of those spatial differences. So
the example that I use in the optics course is if we look at a typical distance, this camera right now is 6 feet away from me. So if I look at the relative distance of 6 feet away from me to the distance between the tip of my nose and my ear, this distance is very small relative to the distance to the camera. But if I bring that camera up here to an inch from my face, now the relative distance between the camera and my face and my nose and my ear has totally changed. So the perspective and the shape of my face in those two shots will be completely different.
Yep.
That's where you get distortion or compression. If I put this camera 100 feet away from me, then the relative distance of me to the background is completely different compared to 6 feet away. And
certainly your nose to your ear is
so my facial features as longer lens further away is going to flatten out. It's actually the perspective difference here is going to flatten out. Or if we come closer, it's going to become more, this big ass nose is going to become even more big.
I think that's a good point to stop.
That's a perfect way to stop this thing. For all 80 people who have hung in with us here, you're troopers, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you for joining us for another CS Presents, this epic 2-hour-long Zoom conference here between two nerds.
Geek to geek by definition, yeah.
Right, great. Sorry, nerds, geeks, however you want to call them.
Well, it's called geek.
Dave Stump did correct me earlier that I'm not a former cinematographer, I'm a recovering cinematographer.
Yes.
So we want to thank you for joining us. You can see a replay of this at cs.inc. Be sure to go to cs.inc for other CS Presents and Creative Solutions Presents, and also the wonderful products from the Creative Solutions Company. Like I showed the PL mounts a little bit there, that I have the PL to the EOS-R, which I'm really, really loving. It's very impressed with the precision of that mount, and the relation to the focus marks was straight on, even though it comes with shimming. It wasn't necessary, and I enjoyed that. Chris, anything last to say before we close out here?
Apologies for domineering a vast majority of the conversation. Just, don't get me talking about something I'm passionate about, because look out.
Well, that's why we're here. We're passionate nerds.
Yeah.
So it was all great information. So a little bit of it was an audiobook version, which was fun.
The shame. And again, you guys can follow us both on Instagram and the Cine Lens Manual on Instagram. If you want to continue this conversation, feel free to fire us some messages, and perhaps that will spark a post we make or something, and we can continue conversations there, and be looking out for updates on the book, which we're slavishly trying to finish. And I am slacking on, and Jay is mad at me for not, stepping up the game, but we have our time. Ebb and flow, Jay. Ebb and flow. You have your moments. So we will work to get that out as soon as we possibly can. And again, thanks for everyone for attending.
Enjoy, everybody.
Cheers.